Last time we talked about, and those who were present for the lecture prior to that, know that we were talking about first philosophy, which is basically another way of describing metaphysics. And the definition of metaphysics is generally the study of the nature of ultimate reality, or the study of being. It's also known as the study of being. Ontology is another way of describing that. The branch of ontology is considered to oftentimes work in conjunction with the branch of philosophy known as metaphysics. They go together in many ways, or have gone together, at least in classical philosophy. Now, first philosophy is, we're going to find largely an attempt to discover the relationship that exists between being and becoming. So write that down. Being and becoming, two very important terms really in the whole history of philosophy. We've seen that some philosophers, namely the Pre-Socratics, we talked about the Pre-Socratics a bit in the last lecture. I mentioned Parmenides and his followers, and how did they interpret reality? Well, they interpreted it in terms of being, but not just that, but they had a way of interpreting being. It's a certain kind of being, and what kind of being is it? It's the kind of being that's in no way subject to change. It's changeless. It's immutable. For these kinds of thinkers, to be real really means to be without change, or to be. It's also known as immobile, to be immobile. Now, at the opposite extreme, we find other Pre-Socratics, like Heraclitus. I didn't mention him last time, but he is another very important figure in ancient philosophy, in Pre-Socratic philosophy. Now, he professed a doctrine of universal change. So this, again, the opposite extreme here of Parmenidean type of thinking. We have change as being a fundamental aspect of reality. So we take these two extremes, and in the middle there is the scholastic notion, more of the Thomistic, or if you like, at least in some ways, the Aristotelian approach to the whole question. So when we speak of the position of the scholastics, we're of course talking about the philosophers during the medieval period that were influenced by Aristotelian philosophy. They didn't hold to every aspect of Aristotelian philosophy, but they were very influenced by Aristotelian philosophy. And they definitely used Aristotelian philosophy in coming to a better understanding of change and being and becoming. So the scholastics hold that change is real. Reality involves change. Change isn't something that the scholastic philosophers deny, so they disagree there with Parmenides. But they also disagree with Heraclitus, that it's only real in relation to a plurality of things that change. So in our endeavor to explain change, we discover really two different meanings of the term being. And also, you might want to write this down also, two very important terms, potentiality and actuality. So we apply these notions to the term being, and so we get potential and actual being. The application of this distinction, really, as I mentioned Aristotle, originally worked out by Aristotle, enables us to work out a general theory of change. Now, this is debated. Keep that in mind. We're talking about scholastic notions that, if you're talking Catholicism, they're still held today. In modern philosophy, there are attempts to get away from this kind of an approach. So just so you know, but as is the nature of philosophy, this is what we have. We have these kinds of debates that are ongoing. Now, in this present lecture, we're going to see how this general theory is specifically applied to the two basic types of change. That is to, and I mentioned this last time, to accidental. So if you haven't written this down, write this down. To accidental, first of all, and secondly, substantial change. So make sure you have that down, accidental and substantial change. Before we do that, though, we need to raise some fundamental questions about the reality of matter. And in so doing, we need to discuss, albeit briefly because of time constraints, the underlying supposition of what is known as materialism, or a materialistic philosophy. And by this, I'm not talking in terms of economics, where we're talking about living a materialistic life that's full of monetary gain, a love of money, a love of material realities, having lots of clothes and wardrobe, houses, that kind of. That's not what we mean when we're talking in philosophical concepts. We're talking materialism in terms of viewing the world in a certain way. Materialism is a monistic view, coming from monos, the Greek word meaning one. Materialism is a way of viewing the world as a type of oneness, and this oneness is just matter. All of reality is material. There is nothing but matter. And of course, this matter can be defined in all kinds of various ways, and has been defined in all kinds of various ways. One need only take a cursory view into physics to realize the extent to which matter has changed very significantly throughout very many scientific paradigms. But without going too deeply into that, I wish I could, because I find that very fascinating, and many of you perhaps do as well. But for now, just remember, materialism is the view that matter only exists. There's one reality in the world, and that is matter. It is a metaphysical view. Interestingly, though, just so you know, there are materialists nowadays who would like to eliminate that term, at least as it works in association with their view of reality. Many materialists don't even wish to do metaphysics. They think metaphysics is a waste of time in philosophy. They think really it's a scholastic medieval notion, or it's a useless ancient notion. Aristotle used it, but now that we're living in a post-Cartesian or postmodern philosophy, or just in analytic philosophy, and of course there are all kinds of different notions that go into both of those. Perhaps we can discuss those later. We don't need metaphysics. Basically, that's what many of them say. And so many of them would like to say that this isn't a metaphysical view, but that wants some serious argumentation. Because if it's not a metaphysical view, then what exactly is it? They may not like the word metaphysics, but it's a little difficult to avoid it. But for now, just know materialism is the view that all of reality is matter. There's no spirit. There's no God, at least a non-material God, as is classically found in Western monotheism with Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. There are some, the reason I mention this is because there actually are some religions that posit God as a kind of material being. In Mormonism, you actually have this. Even though Mormonism wouldn't be a completely materialistic philosophy, but interestingly, it comes very close. It's very anthropomorphic. So materialism is the view that only matter exists. It's anti-dualistic. Dualism is another approach to reality. There are two realities, one material, one non-material or spiritual. We are dualistic beings, according to the dualist. We have a physical body. We also have a non-material mind or soul. There are two, however you wish to define it as a dualist, and dualists define it in various ways. But they're in agreement with respect to there being not one reality, like the materialist would say, but there are two realities. There is matter, to be sure. There is also mind, and they cohabitate together through the body, but also the world. The world is composed of matter and spirit. There's the material world and the immaterial God that created the world. Now, there's one more monistic view that you should know, and that is the view of idealism. It's also known as mentalism. You could also call it ideaism. This is also a fairly ancient view. It is similar to materialism in that it is a monist view, but that is the extent to the similarities. They are diametrically opposed to each other from an ontological standpoint. the materialist is a materialistic monist. The idealist or mentalist is a spiritualistic monist. One reality, but no matter. Sometimes a quip is made. No matter, never mind. All mind, no matter. That kind of thing. But idealism is basically the view that no matter exists. All is mind. So there is one reality, and this one reality is non-physical. Now that, while materialism may sound, even though you may not think materialism is the way to go, philosophically speaking, you might have a problem with it denying all spiritual realities, but still, we're in a material reality. It seems to be something that's fairly obvious. But in philosophy, we oftentimes leave the obvious and get into what goes deeper than that, what goes beyond, what goes under the surface. We look beyond, we look underneath. And some have, even in their motivations to be materialistic, they've left the materialistic monistic way of viewing things and actually concluded that matter is an idea. We have all these sense impressions around us, particulars after particular after particular after particular. But all of these perceptions we have work through the ideas that we have of them. Perceptions, it would be claimed, don't exist without an idea behind them. What would it mean for a perception to exist without an idea, at least as far as human beings go? If I'm looking at a desk, I'm not just looking, my eyes aren't just being bombarded with particles such that I'm able to see an object, namely a desk. I'm able to abstract from that desk and formulate ideas about it that I'm not seeing just with the cornea, the camera, cones in my eyes, the lenses of my eyes, however you wish to say it. So perception is an idea. To be is to be perceived. And perception being an idea, you can't have perception without idea. All perceptions are ideas. Therefore, since reality is conceived of perceptions, all of reality is really nothing but a series of perceptions that are really mental. So all that we see around us, we're seeing through our ideas. So all of reality is really mental. Now, on down the road, we'll go deeper into this when we get to philosophers like Berkeley. Very well-known Irish philosopher, a bishop who was not only an empiricist, but also an idealist. So the tree falling in the forest, does it make a sound? All those kinds of puzzles, those paradoxes, flow really from his philosophy. So he's one of the big names that we'll be talking about. But for now, just to move on, make sure you have down that you have the two monist views, materialism and idealism, and then you have the dualistic view. So let's deal, though, in the scholastic manner with materialism. In delving into this should, I'm hoping at least, this will prepare us for a more robust, you could say authentic understanding of what philosophers mean by matter and form. So let's look at materialism. We'll look at it from the ancient and modern perspective. Now, intimately bound up with the datum of change is the fact that sensible things are material. Now, again, I said remember what I said about the idealist. So right now we're viewing it really from within the constraints of the materialist. Sensible things are materials. Let's just assume that. In other words, we'll assume that sensible things are material. What do we do with that? Now, sensible things are material. Moreover, as with our knowledge of change, our knowledge of this fact also is a matter of direct observation and experience. Now, as to the nature of matter itself, this takes us into some very really these days. All you have to do is just go into physics a bit, especially quantum physics, and you'll see the mystifying aspect of what we're talking about here. So as to the nature of matter itself, we may have many doubts. There are many doubts. There's work still being done on that, even if you're a materialist, like I said. How you define matter can be very problematic, which should reveal to you, in a way, the problem of materialism. But anyway, I'm trying not to let my own philosophical ideas seep into this. Sometimes I can't help it. Okay, but anyway, we may doubt the exact nature of matter, yes, but it's quite clear that the things of our experience are, all of them, material. Now, again, speaking as the materialist here. We have no direct experience of anything, at least in the proper sense of the word, that is not in some sense material. Now, given this fact, it shouldn't be surprising at all that the history of philosophy has been dominated at various times by various forms of materialism. This goes way back. This is not just, even though I mentioned some materialists who want to do away with metaphysics, aside from those, materialism goes very, very far back. The very first philosophers, I've mentioned the Pre-Socratics. I think I mentioned Thales last time, Anaximander, Anaximenes. These philosophers had a materialistic outlook on reality. And true enough, these early philosophers weren't as I'm going to mention a name here you should remember, Father Copleston. He has a huge history of philosophy. I recommend it to any student of philosophy or anybody just interested in philosophy. Father Copleston says these materialists were not dogmatic, who explicitly deny the reality of anything outside of matter. It just simply didn't occur to them that anything outside the visible cosmos did or could exist. They were just looking at it. It seemed to them very sensible. Pardon the way of expressing that. Trying not to sound like I'm using a pun. Yet, since their times, and especially in the modern era, there's been no want of writers who have held on very explicit grounds that matter alone is real. So even though these Pre-Socratics weren't dogmatic, you eventually, as philosophy evolved, you did get these kind of dogmatic materialists that entered into the philosophical scene. So you have such philosophers as Hobbes, who was very much of a what you might call a dogmatic materialist. Now, by and large, all of you should know that the materialism of the early modern era is, another word you might want to write down, mechanistic. It's mechanistic, and I mean by that, it's matter is conceived. It's conceived of in terms of solid inert particles that unite in various ways to make up the differences that we find in things. That's a basic way of stating it. More recently, though, and especially since Darwin's Origin of Species was released, materialists have really come out in all forces in various ways. They've combined with their theory a kind of all-out doctrine of evolutionism. This pervades the thinking of certain American naturalists and the dialectical materialism of Karl Marx. Now, two words there. Again, sometimes I'll throw these terms out. You need to remember these words, though. Like naturalism. Naturalism is just another word. Again, now we could say much more than what I'm going to say, but again, time limits me in what I'm able to explain. As far as how I would like to, it limits me as far as the depth I'd like to go into. But naturalism is just, it's a materialistic notion. Oftentimes they're used interchangeably. They're not necessarily interchangeable, but for now, for all practical purposes of the lecture at this point, we'll use them interchangeably. Naturalism is the view that just the natural world exists. So we'll say it in that particular way. And I mentioned the dialectical materialism of Karl Marx. Just remember, Karl Marx was a materialist. He was a certain kind of materialist. You don't need to know this kind of materialism. We won't go into it in this course, but since I threw it out there in case you were wondering what in the heck did that word mean, he basically took a form of thinking from that he imbibed basically from Hegel, a German philosopher. Hegel was a dialectical pantheist. He believed that all is spirit. He was a kind of idealist. He really didn't believe ultimately in the reality of matter. Matter or history is just really a way of the divine unfolding itself into reality. Well, Marx took that and materialized it basically, and then formed his philosophy of communism. If you wish to do more research in that, I recommend that you do. I, because of time constraints, don't have time to go into it as deeply as I would like. So sticking with just basic materialism as much as possible, in the view of more recent materialists, matter is really, it's not conceived in the same way as it has been in the past. It's no longer to be conceived of in terms of solid inert particles such as we might find in, like, say, the unsplittable atoms of the Greeks, like, say, with Democritus. So instead, it's thought of in more scientific terms as energy and force. Now, when you think of terms like that in conjunction with matter, maybe you can see why some modern-day physicists actually tend towards idealism. Now, when I explained idealism to you, all of you might be thinking, what in the world is he talking about? It seems like such a strange view. But really, once you start delving into physics today, you realize, when you start looking at the terms they're using, the conclusions that they're forming, words like energy and force, matter doesn't seem to be as material as it once was. So in more recent views, life and consciousness and thought itself are really emergent products of an evolutionary process in nature that results from the intrinsic dynamism of matter. Now, on the wider level of metaphysics, and this is what we're really talking about here, just with where we're going, the materialist hypothesis means basically this, that the reality of everything, living or non-living, thinking or non-thinking, and so forth, is ultimately reducible to matter. Now, matter is in quotes, okay, because matter is evolving. Our understanding of matter is evolving, just as our understanding of so many other things in reality. So that should hopefully get you thinking. What matter doesn't, the mechanistic view of matter, it's not as prevalent. Say the Newtonian way of looking at matter is not as prevalent now as was in the past. Matter, as I stated before, is somewhat being dematerialized. It's very interesting, the transition that's being made. And maybe we can understand how this transition has been made by looking at some of the things that the scholastics were looking towards, and their view of matter, and how they viewed matter, and what matter is. And they asked the question, basically, and this is really the fundamental question that we're analyzing here, is anything purely material? Is anything purely material? Now, that's a question to ponder, definitely. And in a moment, we are going to look into what is considered to be the most fundamental argument against, at least on philosophical grounds, against any materialist hypothesis. But before we do this, we need to give a descriptive account of what we mean by a material thing. In other words, given it to be a fact that things, at least some things, are material, how do we understand this fact? It's clear that by a material thing we mean something that we can see, hear, taste, touch, or smell. Remember the definition of empiricism that I gave you. It's such that we can perceive a material thing with our senses. But what is it exactly that we're perceiving when we grasp a material thing, like a horse, let's say? When I'm perceiving a horse, what am I really grasping? What is when I'm grasping that this horse, this figure, this picture? I'm already introducing some concepts in that bring forth some philosophical issues. But anyway, is this thing purely material? Well, the answer to this question, really, at least according to the scholastics, isn't hard to find, because every material thing is a thing having definite proportions. Okay, it's worth repeating. Every material thing is a thing having definite proportions. Write that down, remember, please. So a horse has a determinate size and weight, And in addition to their quantitative dimensions, material things have something else. So let's add this word, qualities. Material things have qualities of a definite kind. Hence, this horse has a certain brown color and a definite shape that mark it off from anything else that exists, be it another horse or a thing of a different kind. Now, this is significant. Now, why? Well, because the fact that no material thing, be it living or non-living, may be characterized as a sort of indeterminate stuff. It's never pure matter that we grasp, but matter that is always informed. Very, very important word here. That is, all matter that we experience, or as we experience it, is characterized by the presence in it of certain definite forms, shapes, and also determinations. And we refer to matter as characterized, or so characterized, as informed. So, is perception made of matter? That's one question you can ask in relation to this. Are our perceptions material in nature? Now, if the answer is yes, think about what that might mean. I'm perceiving a material object, a horse or a desk, whatever it might be, and my perception of that material desk is itself also material. So my physical eye is seeing a physical object, namely a desk. So if you just have a physical thing seeing another physical thing, where do we get ideas from this? Where this reality begins to take on kind of a strange form when you look at it from these kinds of assumptions. Okay, so anyway, matter is the underlying subject of form. That's but one thing we can say here. So what I've described is the experience that we have of any material thing being something, or as something, which, though having matter, is differentiated by all sorts of forms. Now, if we consider the materialist hypothesis now, we have to ask again whether matter alone is real, or what amounts to the same thing, whether matter is the sole principle of being. Now, the fundamental objection to this hypothesis goes as follows. It would appear that material things, as material, all have this in common, that they are capable of, that is, have the potency for, taking on various determinations or forms. Now, this fact is abundantly clear from our initial study of change. So a leaf which changes in color from green to red would be an instance of the same matter taking on or receiving a new or different form. Now, considered from this point of view, matter is a determinable principle inasmuch as it is a subject which receives and is capable of receiving forms not previously possessed and of losing the forms that it had. And this is what I said just a little bit ago. Matter is, in some sense, the underlying subject of form. Now, granting the aforementioned there, we have to ask now whether it's in any way possible for matter to determine itself. Now, why do I ask this? Well, think about it. If matter alone is the sole principle of reality, then clearly matter would have to be the source of its own actuation, and hence, quite literally, identical with the forms that it has. If it be true that matter is a self-determining, self-actuating principle, then how can we also maintain that it is the subject of the forms it receives? This is a difficulty here. As the subject of form, to elucidate a bit, as the subject of form, matter is determined by form and is related to it as potency, as that which is perfectible. So it's related to it as potency. That which is perfectible is related to act, that which perfects. So it would appear to be really a plain contradiction that one and the same principle, matter, could at the same time and in the same respect be determined by form and yet be the source of form. So hopefully everybody follows that. In that respect, in which matter is said to receive form, it cannot be the source of the form it receives. Consequently, if matter does possess certain forms, which it always does, then those forms are distinct, it is really distinct from the matter which they are said to inform. Now, when I say that matter and form are distinct, I don't mean to suggest that they exist in separation from each other. In the case of matter, it's certainly true that matter cannot exist without form. Now, whether there are any forms that exist or can exist apart from matter is another question, and very contentious. But in any case, the forms that we find in matter are always united with the matter which they inform. From what has been said, it should be clear that material things, as we know them, are not purely material. So the answer to the question, is anything purely material? No. Material things can't be purely material, but they are in some sense a real composition of matter and form. Thus, without denying the reality of matter, it must be held that matter and form are principles that are irreducibly distinct from each other. In the light of this fact, it follows that, at least as concluded by many philosophers, that materialism of any kind is at the very least inadequate because it fails to give a proper account of the data at hand. So really, two things here. Matter does not seem to be purely material. In fact, it doesn't seem to. It seems to, if you're going to say that, it seems as though you're engaging in a contradiction. And also, perception itself seems to disprove materialism. Because if your perceptions are material, it seems strange that we have the kind of perceptions that we have as humans, as rational creatures. Some correlations here. Thus far, we've seen number one. Okay, material things are real. And this is a matter of direct observation, a direct experience. Secondly, material things are not purely material, but they're in some sense a composition of matter and form. And thirdly, that in itself matter is not form, but is really distinct from form and is related to it as potency is related to act. All right. Matter and form, then, are genuinely real principles. These are principles we're talking about here, which enter into the composition of all the things of experience. Whether matter and form are the sole principles of these realities is a question we have yet to examine, but not until we've determined in a more precise way what we mean by matter and form. We'll have to discuss that further. For the present, however, it's obvious that matter, as we experience it, is always informed matter, and that the forms most immediately evident are those that we can grasp with our senses. That is to say, sensible forms, like the size, shape, or color of an orange. Okay, so we've focused so far on two basic facts. Now, what are they? All right, first of all, that the things of experience are subject to change. And second, that they are, all of them, material. Now, as independent data, these facts may appear to you as having little or no bearing on each other, but this really isn't so. At the beginning, we indicated that both these facts are really intimately bound up with each other, and from the discussion that follows, why this is so will become more evident to you if it isn't completely evident as of now. All right, so let's talk about different kinds of change. Different kinds of change. All right, now consider, first of all, just some ordinary changes that we experience, whether in ourselves or in our environment. Look at, you can just, all kinds of things can come to mind. Look at cheese. Okay, mild cheese turns to bitter. I have a dog. Her name is Maggie. Sometimes she's silent, sometimes she's not. Sometimes she barks, Other times, she's silent. But her silence leads to barking. So silent dogs begin to bark. A person with pale skin gets a sunburn. Now, in changes such as these, the undergoing subject is no different in kind than originally. Okay, so my dog, Maggie, going from silence to barking, she's still Maggie from the step of silence to barking. So, and a victim of sunburn, however else he feels, is still the same person. In no such example as this does a subject of change undergo a change in its nature. By contrast, we may consider that food, when it's eaten, is no longer food. So if I eat that cheese, is it still cheese? Well, no, it's because it's undergone a substantial change now. Or when an animal dies, it's no longer an animal, but it becomes something else. Here, too, we have instances of real change, but of the kind that does involve a change in nature, and the nature of the thing that changes. Now, in this type of change, the corruption or the privation of the being of one thing entails the generation of something else. And this is what is meant by, and I already mentioned it, substantial change. So write that down, put it in, highlight it, put stars above it, underline it 5 times, 10 times maybe. Substantial change, all right? Now, the importance of understanding both types of change, accidental and substantial, requires us to treat them separately, and that we will do. But we will do that in the next lecture. So I will see you then.